Schuppli, who is going to be speaking tonight, giving a lecture called Earth Evidence. And Susan is the third speaker in our series, The Ethics of Color, and we're really thrilled to have her here tonight. So when we were planning the list of speakers, Susan's work came to my mind immediately. I saw an exhibition of her photos in the Sculpture Center in Long Island City in New York. I guess it was like last fall, maybe fall of 2018. And they were mesmerizing. The colors and luminosity and the spectral colors were images that you would look into and then realize that the meaning was so much deeper than what you were actually looking at. They were capturing the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Her approach to research and image making uniquely positions her to speak on aesthetics as a code for understanding invisible operations, a concept she calls material witness, an exploration of the role of matter as both registering external events as well as exposing the practices and sorry about that. Practices and procedures that enable such matter to bear witness. She is a Swiss-Canadian artist who lives and works in the UK. Her projects have been exhibited throughout Europe, Asia, Canada, and in the US. Recent commissioned works include Learning from Ice, Toronto Biennial of Art, Nature Represents Itself at Sculpture Center. No, that was Trace Evidence.
That was Nature Represents Itself.
Oh, it was? Okay. Yeah. Trace Evidence in the Billmusit, Umia, Sweden, and Atmospheric Feedback Loops, a vertical cinema project for Sonic X in Amsterdam. She's published widely within the context of media and politics, and is the author of a forthcoming book called Material Witness, MIT Press, that will come out in 2020. She received the IACP Infinity Award for Critical Writing and Research in 2016. Susan is director for the Center of Research Architecture in Goldsmiths University of London, and is an affiliated artist researcher as well as the board chair of forensic architecture. Tonight she will speak about her interrogation of material and substances in our built environment that provide traces of complex interactions and circumstantial evidence that can be decoded and reassembled back into a narrative of actual events. We are honored to have her here. Let's please give her a Norfolk warm welcome.
Great. Well, Lisa and Byron, thank you so much for the invitation to come to Norfolk and to the school here and speak about my projects, or some of my projects, and also interact with the students through a kind of workshop seminar that's going to happen tomorrow. And I wanted to begin with a provocation that the American environmentalist Aldo Leopold, he once said something to the effect that we can only be ethical in relationship to that which we can see. So, meaning that we require images, we require representations, we need things to happen in the realm of the visible in order to act in and on the world, to intervene, especially in situations of conflict or crisis, of violence or environmental harm. And this injunction that humans only respond when they're presented with some sort of visible proof, of course I would have to, I certainly agree with him, but I would also perhaps make the caveat that we have lots of examples where the realm of the visible, that is to say images of conflict, of strife, of killings of unarmed civilians. We have lots of examples where the self-evident nature of an image or representation is completely insufficient to producing any form of justice, let alone some sort of legal conviction. So, yes, the realm of the visible, that which we can perceive as humans, is really important in terms of our capacities to respond and to act in an ethical manner. But I think it's really important to acknowledge the ways in which a lot of events are actually taking place far beyond the spectrum of, and the threshold of human perception. And that's really why I wanted to begin by just bringing up this image of the electromagnetic spectrum, which we have here, because the works that I'm going to present tonight are largely works that come out of a series of environmental projects, or projects that have tried to deal with various forms of evidence in relationship to environmental contamination, etc. And of course, when we look at the electromagnetic spectrum, we're reminded that there's a very small, if you see that small band in the middle, which is the realm of visible life that humans can see, but things like radioactive contamination, other things like contemporary algorithmic regimes involving computation such as high-frequency trading or real estate speculation and financialization. There's many different forms of contemporary harm that actually don't abide by any sort of visible kind of principle. But in my case, I think I'd like to move through a series of projects. I've brought lots of clips of videos and some still images, etc., and really try and walk through with you this evening sort of the provocations that are raised when events take place that are often highly dynamic in nature, diffuse. They don't necessarily produce the direct causal links that we might require to establish accountability for events. And where we see that very kind of clearly is with the context, is within the context of environmental pollutants in particular. So I'll begin by an early work that actually takes me to 1986, and of course it's the accident at Chernobyl. And there we have a Geiger counter reading the level of contamination in that particular sort of situation. And then a piece that I produced, which there's an audio that I'll start shortly, but just to suffice to introduce this project, I called it Delay Decay. And what I looked at, I looked at the 19-day period between the event, and Chernobyl was a reactor unit 4 at Chernobyl in the Ukraine, exploded on April 26, 1986. And that was the time of the Soviet Union. It took many, many days before the Soviet Union actually publicly admitted that something had happened. Not only had something happened, something calamitous had happened. That public statement was made on May 15th, 1986 by the then president. And this piece actually was made in a very simple kind of manner. I went to the microfiche library of this library in Canada where I was working at the time, and I was just asking myself, okay, I want to look at all the world's newspapers that they had in that collection, and I want to see what the news was covering, what stories they were covering on April 26th, the day of the accident, and then reading the papers to see when this event finally made its way into sort of public discourse. And when you look at Soviet papers in particular, you see this incredible kind of time, this incredible kind of gap in time. But what's happening in that 19 days, of course, is a massive radioactive release of all kinds of contaminants that are moving across Belarus, Poland, and up into sort of Scandinavia. So this is a vitrine with the covers of the Pravda newspaper, the address by the then President Mikhail Gorbachev, where he's finally admitting that the accident took place, and this very slow-moving kind of image of atmospheric contaminants. This piece will return in the project called Trace Evidence that Lisa mentioned, but I thought this was a useful place to begin. And something I tell I often remark to the students that I work with is if you use a search engine today and you put in April 26, 1986, it's very likely that you will that Chernobyl will be returned as your search that the events of Chernobyl will be returned by the search engine, because what's happened is the digital domain has retroactively corrected the timeline for the event. But if you actually looked at analog media of the time, excuse me, I need some water, you'll find that, in fact, that event didn't really happen on the 26th. It really only comes into public consciousness on the 15th of May. Oh, I hope my voice comes back. But I talk about this with the students because it's a bit of a cautionary note. When we apologies for this, I'm just suddenly losing my voice. Maybe I'll I'll start playing some of the clips and then give me an opportunity to drink some water.
Все вы знаете, недавно нас постигла беда. Авария на Чернобыльской атомной электростанции. Она больно затронула советских людей, взволновала международную общественность. Мы впервые реально столкнулись с такой грозной силой, какой является ядерная энергия, вышедшая из-под контроля. Учитывая чрезвычайный и опасный характер того, что произошло в Чернобыле,
Just to give you a little bit of a sort of snapshot of that installation, as I was saying, I often mention this incident to the students because if we rely entirely on online domains for conducting our research, sometimes really important conceptual and political insights may not actually come our way, which it was really important for me to understand that temporal gap, because in that temporal gap I could start to unpack the entire kind of political history of the event and the failure of the state to provide adequate information to citizens that then received massive doses of contaminants and then were also not evacuated in time, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it was a really important kind of lesson for me to learn that I need to diversify the ways in which I conduct my own sort of investigative or research practices. Now, this image here that we're looking at, this is actually the gamma camera that was used and invented by Toshiba to visualize radioactive contamination inside the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. So we're moving much closer to the present, and modes of sensing radioactive contamination have been developed. They're no longer rely on the sort of sonic sort of syncopation of something like a Geiger counter, but there's actually this is a camera that can actually sense the gamma rays, which are at the far end of the electromagnetic spectrum. And I have a short clip where we see a couple of scientists using it actually in the field, and I'll say a little bit more why it's quite an extraordinary technology.
One scientist involved in these investigations is Satoshi Mori. Mori and his team use a special camera that can show a visualization of the radiation dose. The areas with the highest levels appear in red. It's clear the amount of radiation near the ground is particularly high.
We'll just leave it there. So that gamma camera was actually, it's quite an
Hotspots with exceptionally high levels of radiation are scattered throughout the forest.
Scientists to actually locate radioactive contamination in a very kind of expansive spatial setting. So unlike Geiger counters, which are very highly localized and something 1 meter away or 1 yard away would render a kind of different reading. So this tool became quite useful. And when I was working on my own film about nuclear evidence, I inquired as to whether I could actually borrow that camera from Toshiba, and they said, of course, there's no way that we're ever going to lend in like an amateur camera like that. I mean, and there's much too much kind of obviously concern about somebody who's not a specialist utilizing a camera like that and possibly creating sort of public, perhaps panic, etc. But nonetheless, several years later, a group of scientists did exactly what I wanted to do, which was to use that camera in a very contaminated area inside the prefecture of Fukushima, which is the Itata River Valley, and that valley has a very kind of poor rural community, and that community lived for many months not knowing that they were actually living in one of the most contaminated areas from the accident at Fukushima. And once again, the politics around the nuclear tend to, those who assume the sort of maximal threat or the maximal risk for environmental contaminants are often the poor, right? So a city like Tokyo that runs on a kind of massive kind of consumption of electricity would outsource the risk for its nuclear energy to its rural communities. And that's a very kind of classic scenario that we see all over the world. I produced a trilogy called Trace Evidence, and it looked at 3 incidents. It began with uranium mining in Gabon, another event, the story of Chernobyl, but I told that story by way of Sweden, which was actually where they discovered evidence for the events in Ukraine. And then the final sequence dealt with Fukushima Daiichi. So let me play a couple of clips.
Uranium mining continued throughout southeastern Gabon until 1999, when the economic viability of extraction shifted. Oklo's deposits only lasted until 1985, after which time its waste rock was left to languish. Futile efforts to curtail uranium dust and the extensive leaching of contaminants from the region's many tailing ponds led to the damming of the Matembe River. Trace evidence of its ancient nuclear legacy has since reappeared, but not as a dangerous latency attributable to the cosmic alchemy of early Earth, but rather to that of industrial mining practices.
For 40 years, Comuf, a subsidiary of the French nuclear giant Areva, mined uranium in southern Gabon. The operation has had serious consequences for the health of the workers and locals. Many former miners, both Gabonese and French, have died of lung cancer. Under pressure from NGOs, Areva opened a medical clinic last October, but the staff here don't all have the training or resources to properly diagnose diseases linked to uranium mining.
Ça fait plus de 30 ans. Plus de 30 ans qu'on a ce problème.
Ça fait longtemps, depuis que Comuf existait.
A legacy of colonialism and unnatural resource extraction expressed within the damaged ecosystems of the region and the cellular defects of mine workers and local inhabitants. At Oklo, a lethal archive once etched into its ancient geology now re-emerges within the biopolitical strata of matter.
Cette carrière, aujourd'hui, elle est remplie d'eau. Et lorsqu'on a démantelé l'ancienne usine de la nouvelle, tous les déchets ont été rejetés. Donc, tout ce qui a servi à la construction de l'usine, les fers, les engins de mine, tout a été jeté à l'intérieur de cette carrière.
Tous les déchets venaient des usines. Tous les travaux de la digue ont duré au moins 2 ou 3 ans, hein, parce que c'est bien avant la fermeture de l'usine qu'on a fait ça. C'était pour faire disparaître les traces.
So that's a clip from episode 1 called Geology. I won't show you the section on meteorology, and we'll jump to a clip from the final section, which is called Hydrology. And that dealt with the contaminants from Fukushima Daiichi from Japan. So that accident took place in 2011. And it took 5 years for those contaminants to make their way across the Pacific Ocean, where they finally arrived on the west shore of Canada. And it's a very long journey, took, as I said, many years and through thousands and thousands of kilometers through the currents of the Pacific. And finally, the sort of evidence for this event in Japan emerges on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And so I'll play a clip from that episode. This is webcam footage. It's the only footage that actually exists of the initial explosion and meltdown of the reactor at Fukushima Daiichi on March 11th, 2011.
The release of radioactive materials into the air and water had begun. While Chernobyl's fallout would eventually spread across extensive tracts of arable land throughout Europe, Fukushima's contamination seems to have traveled further still, crossing some 7,600 kilometers through the vast microbial channels of the Pacific, reaching the western shores of British Columbia many years later.
Scientists say that traces of radioactivity from the nuclear accident in Japan 4 years ago have washed up on Canada's coastline. It's the first time they've detected materials from the accident in North America, but they say the amounts don't pose a threat to living creatures.
So, the response, in fact, by Fisheries and Oceans Canada was to change the acceptable level of radioactive contamination. So, that being said, I do believe them when they say it's not necessarily detrimental to human health, but there's been lots of examples of bluefin tuna, for example, swimming off the west coast of California that are highly toxic because they spawn in the waters directly off of Honshu Island where the accident took place. So, but one thing I wanted to draw your attention to by bringing up this image was this was actually quite unusual. This was there was a trial. It's still ongoing, where the three, like the CEO, the chief financial officer, etc., the three most important kind of figures that run the Tokyo Electric Power Company, or TEPCO, the company that owned the nuclear plant, they were charged with criminal liability. And that trial is still ongoing, and it's quite unusual to have the main CEOs of a major corporation, to see them actually on trial and some sort of, in the hopes that some sort of compensation will ensue. That was very different from the situation in Chernobyl, for example, whereas in Chernobyl, it was, first of all, the trial was actually held. Russian law demanded that the trial actually be held in direct proximity to the site of the crime, so-called, and so it was a closed trial within the exclusion zone and off limits to journalists, and just a few very kind of low-level officers and engineers were charged, found guilty, and sent to a kind of hard labor camp. And but then in Kiev the following year, there was this extraordinary image that appeared. It was extraordinary for me because the banner that the protesters were holding up read, "We demand a Nuremberg trial for Chernobyl," and I thought that was really quite significant because it also tells us that Nuremberg, the trial that was held after the Second World War, that was really the paradigmatic kind of precedent for putting a state on trial. And so this sort of mass protest in the Ukraine, in Kiev, made this sort of public demand that it was insufficient to simply allocate responsibility on the part of the Soviet state to a handful of kind of low-level employees, and that the state somehow needed to be accountable. And that courts have been an important part of the work that I do, both within forensic architecture, but also with the students in the center. And in my work dealing with environmental contaminants, something that's very, very crucial and very important is the fact that under, in particular, American criminal law requires the condition or the burden of direct causality. So you have to prove that A was responsible for B, and that is the only way that you can prove someone to be, and it has to be a person, that someone is criminally responsible for their acts. Well, most environmental incidents and events don't operate in this sort of chain of direct kind of causal links. Contaminants are often very dispersed. They sometimes take years to move through different environmental systems, or they enter into food cycles, they enter into people's bodies, but the consequences are often sort of latent or delayed. So this burden of direct causality doesn't work very well within the context of environmental law. So what you tend to see is lawsuits that ask for compensation, and they would be filed under something called like toxic tort litigation. So not criminal liability, but financial or payment of compensatory damages, for example. I actually did quite a bit of work on a particular legal tribunal, which was the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. I'm just going to take us very briefly into the evidence vault, and then I'd like to play the opening sequence of the documentary that I produced out of that called Material Witness. So I'll just speak over this material. So we're entering into the evidence vault.
However, on the 26th of March, my camera had been burned. As I have
This
mentioned,
is the evidence vault for the court, where we see all the videotapes and photographs and audio recordings that were that entered into the legal proceedings, and these proceedings took over 20 years. So it was the trials that dealt with the wars in the 1990s in the Balkans. And this is the vault, which I was fortunate enough to be able to enter into. And in working with some of this evidential material, I worked on 2 cases. And as I said, I produced this video called Material Witness, but I took 2 very different incidents, and they were both historic situations that came out of ethnic conflict, in which there was a massacre that had been captured by a camcorder and a mobile phone. And I looked at these 2 events, one which produced a very kind of significant legal trial, and the other case, which took place in Sri Lanka much later, 10 years later, in 2009, where there's been absolutely no accountability for the actions that took place. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I think it's important within the context of what I've tried to talk about is how is it that we can actually perceive events, especially events of historical violence, where we don't always encounter those in the sort of present realm. We have to develop other ways of sort of accessing these kinds of histories. I'm just going to jump ahead just to give myself enough time. So this is, as I said, the sort of opening sequence of this particular project.
What does it mean to stand in the place of death? Knowing violent things happened right here, but seeing apparently nothing. No trace effects, no signs of struggle, no visible residue to alert us to what transpired. We balance our camera on a makeshift tripod, pull focus, and zoom into the distance, scouring the point at which landscape meets the horizon lines of history. Why does the camera perform its acts of image capture with such unblinking confidence, when we ourselves are still hesitant? Unsure that we are looking in the right place, or in quite the right way? Despite the camera's capacity to confront scenes of horror with perfunctory ease, we do not release our machines entirely to the operations of automated vision. We are still convinced that, set to manual, will bring us into contact with the event if we recalibrate the intensity with which we look. The camera's task is to record, ours to see into the depth of historical shadows. There are machines that saw these events unfold, but from such a distance that only the scale of mass violence was registered by the pixelated mesh through which single bodies slipped, disappearing into the mathematical ether of satellite resolution. We used these machine-made images to find our way here, in landscapes where territories and maps have changed hands and names, the fluctuating nomenclatures of ethnic conflict. We pull off by the side of the road and pull back from the territorial scale recorded by orbiting satellites. Our driver points to a grove of coconut palms to our left. Sentinels without their leafy canopies. Decapitated during the war, he says. How can one learn to decode the semiotics of landscapes, in which generative growth rapidly reprograms environments and deletes history? Certain satellite sensors can read through the subterfuge and stresses of nature, measuring the wavelengths and intensity of visible and near-infrared light reflected by the Earth's surface back up into space. But on the ground, different modes of looking are required. A single tree can register an event, or trampled grass in a meadow can archive the crushed weight of bodies.
So in that project, obviously, I'm treating the environment somewhat differently. The environment is, I'm trying to read the landscape and the environment to offer up sort of clues or traces. So it's a much as to what had happened in those places, knowing I was going back to sites where very violent things happened within the context of two civil wars. And so I was treating the landscape quite differently than the works that I've done, for example, that deal with trying to understand environmental contaminants. In those cases, I might be really using this sort of sound to denaturalize the kind of the image of nature, if you will. And so the Material Witness Project is important for me because it's a kind of injunction that, as I said at the very beginning, that asks us to develop different modes of sensing, different modes of what might we peer into the depths of the historical shadows, as Walter Benjamin wrote. And so that kind of conviction that there is something not something to see, but something that can be sensed if we pay specific attention in very particular ways. I'm completely kind of convinced of that, but as an artist, one has to try and somehow develop sort of strategies to also render that into perceptibility. I'll just show you a few images from the project that Lisa saw, and then I'd like to show, I think, clips of 3 other kind of works, and then we'll kind of eventually we'll open it up to questions. So this is the project that I did on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill that I called Nature Represents Itself, and it was, once again, there was a very interesting legal case that emerged, which was the Ecuador filed a suit against British Petroleum because Ecuador has a Pachamama constitution that allows nature to make, to go into court and to seek kind of damages. And so there was a case filed against British Petroleum, albeit it was not successful, but it was an important kind of legal precedent, if you will, where nature actually was taking an oil and gas company to court. And also what interested me with this specific case was the ways in which there was virtually a complete kind of media blackout on the part of the company. So the images that we saw were largely this kind of image, which was taken by the U.S. Coast Guard. This is part of the installation at the Sculpture Center. So what we have there on the wall is actually this image that was produced by Public Lab, which was made using attaching cameras to kites. And because of this kind of media ban, Public Lab emerges as an activist group to try and sort of capture some information on this event that is unfolding across the communities of the Gulf. And so, as I said, Public Lab emerges, and they produce these very kind of DIY image sets. This is hundreds of little photographs that are put together, and this is what it produces, this very kind of strange photographic kind of image. But there we actually have some sort of glimpse of the oil spill as it's moving across near Chandeleur Island, as the caption says. There was, of course, the underwater video feed. So despite, obviously, the media ban, there were this kind of image was certainly prevalent. And then also Earth orbiting satellites. So BP certainly couldn't stop the Landsat Earth observation satellites from taking kind of images. And so these were a couple of images that Landsat produced where we can see the kind of encroachment of the oil spill towards the coastline. So there are these automated forms of image capture that are happening. But there's also a really important image that was actually emerging, at least this is my argument, and that would be let me stop. I'm just going to stop that, and then I'll play it. That would be the image of the spill itself, because in the scientists that work on like the viscosity of oil, when hydrocarbon atoms interact with oil, they actually produce what is called an oil film, and that's where we see those kind of very lurid, sort of incandescent colors. And what that is the molecules of oil are interacting and refracting the light differently, so it's producing something that is kind of like a quasi-photographic kind of image, certainly operating very much with the same sort of principles of light, chemistry, sort of parabolic mirrors, etc. And I wanted to ask if the spill could be, and the Gulf could be, a kind of legal agent, then why not actually also an aesthetic agent as well? And so here's just a kind of mock-up of the way that one would have encountered this other piece in the gallery, which is an actual simulation. And so we have, and I can maybe talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A, but I just wanted to give you a sense of this piece. And I'm going to play a couple of minutes, because we'll hear the, if you were to put on the headphones, you would hear part of the kind of legal case being read out in court. So this is
Quito, Ecuador, 26th of November 2010. The Honorable Secretary General Constitutional Court of Ecuador. Lawsuit on behalf of the rights of nature under the principle of universal jurisdiction. Under the principle of universal jurisdiction, we, Vandana Shiva, an Indian national, member of the Research Foundation for Science, Technology and Ecology, Ana Luz Valadez, a Mexican national, member of Desarrollo Alternativo, Diana Murcia, a Colombian national, member of the Instituto de Estudios Ecologistas del Tercer Mundo, Blanca Chancoso, a Quichua Ecuadorian national, member of Ecuador, Cecilia Cherres, member and president of Acción Ecológica, Nimo Basi, a Nigerian national, member of the Oro Watch Network, Delfín Telesaka, a Quichua Ecuadorian national, member and president of Ecuador, Alberto Acosta, an Ecuadorian national, and Líder Góngora, an Ecuadorian national, member and president of Silcondem, hereby submit in defense of the rights of the sea, understood as an integral part of nature, which the Ecuadorian Constitution of 2008 recognizes as a subject of rights, and which we recognize as a giver of life, of which we form part. The present lawsuit filed under the principle of universal jurisdiction against the transnational corporation British Petroleum plc, headquartered in the United Kingdom, as the responsible party for the environmental disaster that struck the Gulf of Mexico on the 20th of April 2010.
So those are a few projects that deal with this sort of entanglement between legal systems and various forms of harm, including obviously political violence, but also certainly kind of environmental violence. And then the last few clips that I want to show you are projects that deal they deal much more with the ways in which environmental systems are being regarded, certainly in particular by scientific communities in relationship debates around climate change as kinds of media systems themselves. So this is a 35 millimeter film that I produced in the Netherlands, working with a group of climate scientists. And there's a very tall tower on the site at 213 meters. So I think that would probably be maybe close to 300 yards, perhaps, something like that. This is the film. So as I said, it's a 35 millimeter film shot in a vertical kind of format called atmospheric feedback loops. And I made a couple of horizontal clips just to give you a sense of what that project was like, because it doesn't really translate very well to a horizontal screen ever. So this is just a kind of, as I said, a little bit of me making sort of clips to give you a sense of the project. I'll just play a couple of them. But you would have experienced it in this very kind of soaring, kind of vertical format. And there's the kind of projector that had to be built to actually project these 35 millimeter film with this sort of anamorphic lens that opened up the sort of the frame, so producing this very long kind of vertical image format.
Noise is seen as a distortion. So we have thermal noise in the receiver itself, so that's the electrical noise generated by the instruments themselves. But we also have noise from the outside, so if you do a measurement, it's not only the cloud producing signal, it's also other things. A bird might produce a signal, an airplane might produce a signal. That's noise to us. When you talk about noise in this concept, so signal in comparison to noise, then noise is just something we don't want. On the other hand, if you do a pure measurement, then what you mainly measure is pure noise. Because if you look at the unprocessed data coming from the clouds, it's like noise. And we use our processing to get the signal, the data, out of this noise. Because it's hidden in there somewhere.
And a clip from the very end of the film.
A story is repeated here at Cabal. The artist Joseph Beuys once theorized that the unique atmospheric properties of light, which had inspired Dutch painters since the 17th century, had disappeared with the land reclamation projects of the 1950s. As post-war modernization began its terraforming operations throughout coastal regions of the Netherlands, the air was said to have lost its refractive shimmer due to the diminished number of water molecules carried inland by prevailing winds.
We use a painting from the 17th century landscape painter Jacob van Ruysdael. In fact, this is what he painted, the Dutch skies. Well, without knowing it, he recorded all the complex things about atmospheric research that we're studying.
The scientists conducting research here are recording even more dramatic changes as atmospheric feedback loops between land, sea, and air reveal long-term amplification of climate change signals. Terrestrial, aquatic, and atmospheric mediums have been forcefully remixed, creating radical new forms of unnatural media.
I think I'll just... I wanted to end by showing a short clip from a much earlier project called Can the Sun Lie, because it takes me to my current work, which is on ice core research. So I'll just play a minute of this and then show you some images from the current project, and then we can open it up if anyone has any sort of questions. So we should be finished in a few minutes.
Indigenous observations and their oral transmissions are reshaping the epistemic frameworks required for understanding long-term environmental transformations. A reordering of expertise and its claims to truth that turn on the evidence proffered by nature itself.
Climate change here in the Arctic is particularly rapid
The impacts and the effects of climate change challenge and threaten our very right and our ability to exist as an Indigenous people.
Over the years, nobody has ever listened to these people. Every time the discussion is about global warming, about the Arctic warming, it's scientists that go up there and do their work, and policymakers depend on these findings. Nobody ever really understands the people up there. In the Canadian Arctic, the sun is setting many kilometers further west along the horizon, and the stars are no longer where they should be. Something is happening. Sunlight is behaving differently in this part of the world, as the warming Arctic air causes temperature inversions and throws the setting sun off kilter. Light is bending and deceiving the eyes that have tracked the position of the sun for generations, using it as an index of place and a marker for direction. The crystalline structures of ice and snow are twisting and morphing, producing a new optical regime born out of climate change. The sun has finally become a liar, colluding with the melting topographies of the north, so much so that it can no longer be trusted to guide the Inuit hunters home as it once did.
So, I mean, that project, the name for that project actually, Can the Sun Lie, was actually something that an American judge said in 1886 when photographs first started to enter into legal proceedings. And the judge actually asked in this case, actually in Virginia, asked, can the sun lie? What he was asking was whether the sunlight in combination with photochemistry could actually produce a false truth. So was the photograph an accurate representation of reality and could be trusted within a juridical proceedings, or was sunlight actually an active agent in deceit in producing a kind of image that could skew reality and thus produce a sort of false kind of false proof, if you will? And I thought it was a very provocative, a very provocative question to have asked, and that piece begins in the 19th century and eventually tries to deal with certain kind of debates around climate change and also the kinds of, and also climate change denial. So it shifts between these sort of two kind of moments, a historic moment around photography and the 19th century, and then the sort of 21st century, and the ways in which what Indigenous people are seeing in the North is being denigrated, and actually by climate scientists who say that Indigenous people must be hallucinating and seeing things if they're remarking that the setting sun is actually slowly shifting in the sort of sky. And in fact, thermal inversions have actually changed the optical properties of the atmosphere in the Arctic regions, and so light is actually bouncing around differently because of global warming, because the ice pack is slowly becoming more and more dense. So the crystals of the snowpack, in fact, are producing this kind of distorted image, if you will. And so these are just some images of the current project that I'm working on right now, called Learning from Ice, which works both with ice, begins in the Ice Core Archive, so that's the work that I'm doing right now, and then eventually involves a field school with Arctic College in Nunavut with a group of students. This is an ice core, and this is an ice core actually from Antarctica. I will be in the Arctic, not in the Antarctica, but what we see with that black band there, that's dust from a volcano 22,000 years ago. So ice cores are these very kind of extraordinary kind of materials because they can tell us the sort of kind of deep history of climate change, in fact. And here's just scientists sort of cutting up these cores in the lab, another kind of detail. And then I was in Scripps Institute earlier in the year, and I'm just holding a piece of like 20,000-year-old Antarctic ice in my hand, and those are little air bubbles of CO2 that have been captured in the air. So these chunks of ice can tell us what the temperature of the Earth was now 800,000 years ago, probably 1 million in the not too distant sort of future. So ice cores are these extraordinary kind of temporal probes that can really tell us this kind of in some way, very detailed history of the changing temperature of the planet, such that we can't really, the argument that, say, contemporary forms of global warming are part of kind of sort of a cyclical process really have to be kind of dramatically disputed by the evidence held in this sort of ice core archive. So I think I'd like to end there, and I hope that that's sort of giving you some insight into the ways in which I'm trying to work between legal questions, different ways in which materials are registering events, and also trying to develop a kind of aesthetic language appropriate to this kind of political landscape, if you will. So thank you so much for your patience and attention. I'm happy to answer any questions, but maybe it would be good to turn up the lights if we do that. But I also, if people need to go, that's absolutely fine as well. I took a little bit longer, but that's what happens with time-based media. Sure?
I was wondering, I wanted to ask a question maybe for the students also in the room. I wanted to ask a question for the students in the room as well, because there's so many different contexts to create art and visions for one's work. And I'm wondering, like, I did first see your work in a gallery, but I'm wondering if ultimately that is the best place for your work, and how do you feel about that?
Like I see my role I see my role as sort of an artist engaged in different forms of public narration. That's kind of the way that I would describe it. And so the gallery is one place, and I think in a constellation. And I don't think, I would argue that no artwork is, no context and no art is in and of itself sufficient. I think it needs to be mobilized or activated in a number of different kind of forms. So I think doing a talk here right now tonight is part of the sort of practice, and I think it needs this. It needs the gallery. The piece that I did in the Netherlands, that film has been shown a lot by the scientists in their community, and they've some of them have actually even written on it, because they're also facing the challenges of how to narrate their very complicated work to a public that doesn't necessarily know that much about the intricacies of atmospheric research or climate science. And so they're facing similar problems of how to represent what they do to publics, and certainly like research funding is contingent on being able to be engaged with various sort of publics. So that's the way that I would ideally like to see my work, is moving across different kinds of domains. And I'm also a teacher, so a big part of what I do is actually working with students. So the project Learning from Ice is also going to be working with a group of students, both taking some students from Goldsmiths, but more importantly, the students that are based in Nunavut, and working together. So that's the way that I would like to think about my practice. And the gallery, I think galleries are, I realize I really have come to this realization through the work that we did in forensic architecture, where we often were in courts of law and other kind of policy sort of institutions. And I think art galleries and cultural spaces are some of the most progressive in terms of what they actually will permit as a debate, as a discussion, as a series of representations, what have you. Like, we've been able to do a lot more in gallery spaces than we can do pretty much in any other kind of institution, which is very oftentimes has a lot more kind of strictures around what's permissible. So that's a sort of long answer to your question. Yeah. Yes?
I was wondering about like their use of voice in the documentaries, because it seems like really important. Like, I guess it seems important, and it also seems like a really specific choice in like the kind of like voice that you use to narrate or like dictate these things. And I was just wondering like if you could speak more about that.
No, absolutely. I think this is a really astute question because it's something that the use of the voice, I mean, at a certain point, I mean, I enjoy the activity of writing, and sometimes I feel I've got, like, there's complicated stories I want to tell, and how to do that without having a kind of narrator. But for me, the narrator also became, I thought, actually counterproductive because I'm trying to make an argument around the capacity of materials to be expressive of their condition, and that sound seems slightly kind of contradictory if there's then using a voiceover to actually make that sort of argument. So, so the piece in the Sculpture Center, for example, didn't have voiceover narration. The only thing that you could hear was the lawsuit if you put on the headphones, but the simulation had just a more sort of ambient sort of soundtrack, and so that's that's the challenge I've given myself is with this current work is not to produce a voiceover narration, but like for example when we're working in the Ice Core archive, I'm trying to use like ice cores as this medium of exchange, and so have the scientist or whoever's talking about the material object, I want them to actually interact with the object so that their practice that's attached to this material is actually what's being communicated rather than a voice that tells us what's sort of happening. So to kind of stage that encounter between, like in the case of the lab, it will be the ice core and the ice core scientist. It will be very different what happens in Nunavut. And then we'll spend time in Norway as well in relationship to that that part of the project deals with kind of very long-term historic kind of Sami environmental kind of activism. But I think your observation is critical, and it's the sort of project I've given myself to try and develop another kind of mode of narration that's much more materially based into, and actually also sound helps me in that regard tremendously because I can really use sound to create sort of tension in a shot or to somehow denaturalize what might look like a kind of standard image of an environment or something like that. Mm-hmm.
Do you find that the scientists with whom you collaborate are ready to participate in your art, or are they skeptical? How do they respond?
Well, to be honest, you have to find kindred spirits, and that's the only way you can actually go about anything like that. And so the scientists are based at the University of Delft in the Netherlands, and that university has, their mandate is that knowledge must be open source. And so they were I shouldn't say keen, they weren't seeking me out, but when I approached them and met them, they were interested to be involved. But what was kind of interesting in my first encounters was it was kind of like when they were talking about their work, it was like the kind of standard talk I'm sure they've sort of given 100 times and kind of generic. And so, but in spending time working with them and recording, and I was there for quite a while, so eventually they said, here's the keys to the observatory, and when you're finished, can you kind of lock up? And that was a sort of nice moment. But what I think, I'm going to answer this question slightly circuitously, but what was amazing, though, I have to say, was they're also surprisingly also quite philosophical, and so they were telling me the story about Joseph Beuys, and which was just kind of a wonderful coincidence. And but not only that, the thing that they were also the thing that they recognized was they're working with in the Netherlands in the 16th century. There's this very kind of well-known tradition of Dutch landscape painting, and you have these key painters who produced literally hundreds and hundreds of paintings of in particular the skies, the Dutch sort of skies in and around their villages. And so the scientists there at this observatory, they're saying, like, we didn't have photographs, we don't have like any kind of data that tells us about what the clouds were like in the 16th century, but we have hundreds of these Dutch landscape paintings, and they're looking at those paintings to understand atmospheric conditions, to the point that the new observatory that they're building is called the Jacob van Ruijsdal Observatory. So it was a kind of unique moment for me, because they understood the sort of value of cultural work, and that cultural work from hundreds of years ago could actually furnish important contemporary data that they were actually plugging into the global climate model. So that was, in some way, a lot of things fell into place, and I think the piece relies on those kinds of, having a kind of rapport with scientists, and scientists who actually also are reflective of their own practice and can communicate to people who are sort of non-experts. And I've had so that worked exceedingly well, but then I've also had experiences in the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague, and where the prosecutor, like one in particular, he said he was deeply offended by my work, and that because I was interested in all kinds of things that happened in the court that he thought that's completely beside the point and getting in the way of convicting a kind of war criminal. He goes like, Susan, I don't have time to even think about the kinds of things that are interesting to you, because I have a job to do, and it's, which is this person that's been indicted needs to be found guilty and incarcerated. And so it was actually very hostile to an artist who wanted to sort of reflect on the ways in which evidence was moving through the legal process. And because for me, what was kind of extraordinary is when all of these different photographs and films and video move through the trials, you start to see the ways in which they reveal or they disclose the logic of the system. So in that case, I had to produce a very different project, because I didn't have a person who I could sort of meet halfway, and there didn't seem to be any sort of common ground. So I think it's totally reliant on the kinds of individuals that you can meet, and certainly with the Ice Core project, once again, I've met some really fantastic kind of researchers who are like really interested. They find the materials that they're working with are extraordinary, and they're excited about these materials. They have a great affection for them, and they're really thrilled that somebody else finds what they're doing and the materials they're working with equally kind of fascinating and significant, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the talk. I was struck by this idea of developing strategies to bring you closer to the event, or even at one point you said it's not necessarily the event meant to be seen, but to be sensed.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of answered that, I think, in both questions here. One was that sound is contributing to that tension between not necessarily completely revealing it or exposing it, but trying to get close to it through different senses, whether it's this image or the combination of sound and image. But I was wondering if you can elaborate on that a bit as well, that kind of tension of not exposing or completely demonstrating the event, but trying to get as close as possible.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's an interesting challenge, and sometimes it's like, I mean, I'm not sure I'll be able to kind of answer that. Like I like this concept of critical proximity. So I think it's like, like getting closer to the event doesn't necessarily give us more information about the event. It's like how, I mean, and so I'll talk a little bit maybe more in terms of what we do in the center, because we have a lot of students and investigators that are looking at events that happened quite far away, and so it's how do you access events that necessarily haven't taken place in the community that you grew up in or have experience of, but I worked on the UN drone strike investigation, and we were investigating events that happened in northwest Waziristan, sort of Pakistan. Our only access was not on the ground, but it was using remote sensing kind of technologies, doing kind of before and after imagery, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of getting closer to the event. I also sometimes you get closer to the event by through processes of mediation and translation. Being able to touch something isn't necessarily what I would mean by kind of getting kind of closer to the event, but at the same time, I do believe in that we can have that. I don't believe that we need to have a sort of objective and distanced, or that distance is required to look at something kind of objectively. I would refute that. So I think one can have a kind of criticality to something that one has deep kind of personal stakes in, but I probably haven't answered your question entirely. At the same time, it's about, if we think about a kind of sensorium of experience, which includes the acoustic, the visual, the tactile, the haptic, etc. So the visual isn't always the privileged sense organ by which we sort of make contact with something. I think that's also really important, and that's something I would like to stress.
This is a slightly related question. I recently heard a lecture at Scripps by a woman who has discovered all these under, like 2.5 mile under the ice lakes.
Lakes?
And,
oh, okay.
And she's really excited they're drilling way down there and just about to bring up several million-year-old water. So what's it like to have a 20,000-year-old ice cube in your hand?
Well, I have to say it was sort of exhilarating, but of course I've touched a meteorite in like whatever the observatory at Greenwich, which I realize is far older and doesn't even come from planet Earth. Like I thought, well, it's weird to touch an object that's actually not of this place. I found that also kind of, but the one thing I am really interested in, and this is, the lake is an interesting example because permafrost, which is actually not ice cores, it's a different kind of core, but it's quite controversial, these scientists that are digging into these glacial lakes, because there's microbial life that has never been on planet Earth as we know it for hundreds of thousands of years. And so it's very contested within scientific communities. Do you actually break through, possibly contaminate, or do we leave that alone? I mean, so this, like, because once you puncture that, there's no going kind of back, and either you might introduce alien bacteria, but you're also in some way, in the same way that permafrost in particular releases a lot of organic matter that's been frozen for a long sort of time. So there's a lot of sort of ethical questions that also come out of that kind of research, because there is obviously this, even within the ice core community, you always hear about the kind of the plan to reach a million years, to go back a million years in time, and that is the kind of horizon that's sort of driving the research, which isn't entirely true, but it's definitely part of the public kind of discourse, is this sort of like the scientific activities that always want to kind of push at the kind of the limits or the threshold of human sort of capacity. So anyway, that's my sort of thinking about that kind of activity. I personally, I don't think we should be actually that we should actually be penetrating into these subglacial lakes and introducing kind of contaminants. And there's, which is always a kind of major risk.
How much of your projects are like premeditated, and how much is influenced by the sort of discoveries that happen in the research that you're doing with some of the scientists? For example, like finding the ash from the volcano and that ice core, was that something that you knew would exist there, or was it a discovery from?
No, I mean, yeah, there's like hundreds and hundreds of like technical papers that talk about all kinds of sediments, dust, lead. I mean, there's scientists that are looking at the rise and fall of the Roman Empire because they're like lead diminishes in the ice core record. But lead, for example, has reappeared very recently because lead in the ice core record disappeared in the 1970s with a lot of environmental regulation, but has suddenly reappeared. And so it's someone in the world, some country or countries, are producing massive quantities of atmospheric kind of lead and lead poisoning again. So no, scientists write up their research findings based on the stratigraphy of the core, but the project, the way that I'm organizing this project, I'm using specific cores to tell particular kind of stories. So it's not about like ice cores in general, but every core has a very, I'm looking at kind of very unique cores to tell very specific kinds of stories. So other examples would be like there's cores that have all kinds of meteorite particles in them, for example, or in the case of the Canadian Arctic and the sort of Yukon, it tells a very different story of the Holocene because there's wild fluctuations in the core record, even though geologists would say the Holocene was the most stable kind of geologic period of our time and climatically very stable, that allowed for human life as we know it to sort of flourish or emerge. And so I'm trying to use those cores almost as kind of as characters in the film, and every core, like including the one that you commented on, is a kind of subject that allows me to narrate one particular kind of aspect, from kind of more historic to kind of very kind of contemporary stories about this resurgence of lead, which is actually coming from a certain part of China, for example. It's certainly not, I mean, but the short answer is there's, thousands of people work in the field of ice core science or cryospheric science, and they publish articles and things, and I'm working on the Arctic region, the circumpolar region in the Arctic, because unlike Antarctica, you actually have indigenous human habitation. In the circumpolar region, the politics are very different. You have, Russia, the United States, Canada, Norway, Sweden, Finland, all having all kinds of contestations around their changing sovereignty because the ice is changing their borders, etc. So it's an interesting area to work in. And so I'm just using these different examples of ice to sort of tell this rather kind of complicated set of sort of stories around that I'm calling learning from ice. What are the different knowledge practices that we can utilize, from indigenous knowledge to climate science to legal questions?
There are times when you can't find, like you have a project and you can't find collaborators or assistants, and the archive goes silent. And in those instances, what can you do, or what do you do?
I mean, it's a great question, because I think this is the huge advantage that the artist has over the forensic architecture investigator, because I do give myself permission to manufacture things, and I think that lots of things have disappeared, or we could even ask, why is there no evidential trace? There should certainly be some sort of record, but where is that record? That record was either willfully destroyed or for some reason was never actually sort of documented in the first place. And I think the artist then has to actually use that limitation as, or to turn that around and say that's not a limitation to the work I can do. That is the necessity for producing the work. And how do we create an archive where none existed before? Maybe we have to produce it through a series of correlations and say, well, that must have existed. You know, there must be, or how can I tell this story through some sort of tangential sort of means? And but I do think as artists, we have this sort of extraordinary advantage to give ourselves permission and to put materials and together in order to produce kind of work where when I'm in the sort of forensic architecture camp, we can't do anything that won't stand up in a court of law. So you can't take kind of creative liberties, because that would just throw your report would just simply be seen as lacking any authority or credibility. So I think we have to use those voids, if you will, as creative opportunities. Yeah. Oh, you had a question?
So I was really struck by how your work appreciates and is sensitive to like a whole constellation of ways of seeing, and often those are like forced upon an event that you're representing circumstantially. So I was curious how you choose a way to represent these things when you're making a final product. Because I noticed you had a lot of different, at least, ways of filming photographing.
Yeah, I mean, another excellent question. I mean, I'm a bit of a formalist in the sense that I give myself rules that I have to follow. And so if I'm working with archival material, then I would almost rarely have that go full frame. I would always try and develop a visual, like in the, let's say the sort of video works, I would try and develop a visual language that someone knows when something is archival or when it's something that I've shot myself. So I establish those kinds of, I make those decisions in advance. And to me, that's kind of really crucial. And so that's one of the things that I do. As a self, it's also really important, I think, to start thinking about sound from the very beginning. Oftentimes people tend to think of it as an afterthought, and it's like when you're actually, in as much as you might be shooting images, it's like to be producing kind of audio recordings and using, so I like to use, for example, many different kinds of microphones, like from contact mics to microphones that can tap into the electromagnetic spectrum, that can tune into other kinds of frequencies. So also using materials like that. I think it's good to establish, to not simply, I think it's like, okay, what am I trying to say? It's like, I mean, at its best, I would hope to try and work with like my tools in a way that was conceptually kind of relevant to the thing that I'm trying to, the story or the event that I'm trying to sort of communicate, right? So that it's not simply I would just use this camera and this lens. No, it's like understanding that the ways in which a camera looks at something is very different than the way a human being looks at something, and to generate that awareness in the thing itself. That would be my goal. And I mean, I think I'm not there yet, but that's sort of my ambition, is to try and, so when you're looking at something, one is aware that a machine is looking at that, for example, rather than a human being is looking at that. That would be, at least that's what I'm trying to do right now with this sort of work. So it is about, I think it is about having a certain kind of analytical, kind of like, analytical attention, and not just using the tools that we're familiar with and the way, and I guess it's all, I mean, I believe strongly that we should constantly be challenging ourselves and trying to move out of our sort of comfort zone and not simply use the materials that were our kind of go-to materials as artists, but actually look at how is that tool or that technology or that software that's actually reorganizing the world for us, and that should somehow be part of the piece, not just a means of representing something. That needs to be somehow part of the project for me. Yeah. But it's another really excellent question for sure. These are all questions that are in somewhere. It's interesting because they're questions that I'm like grappling with at this very moment as an artist and trying to rethink my own sort of practice and to sort of sharpen it, I guess, in some way. So the fact that those questions are coming my way, it sort of affirms that that's actually what I need to do as well. So that's quite useful. Yeah.
Any last questions? Well, why don't we continue this conversation at our house, which has formerly been known as the South House, and is now being called right here. Chocolate, come on.